Hello, everybody. Hope you are doing well today. I just want to mention a couple things before we get started. Number one, apologies, I'm posting this a little later today than I normally do. That is only because I had a meeting earlier in the morning, so you can expect the rest of my lectures to come at the normal time in the morning. This is just going to be a little bit different just because of the previously mentioned meeting beforehand. So, a couple things for this week, however, is that first and foremost, we are going to be talking about some very controversial things, especially in the first 2 days. And I want to, actually, first 3 days, now that I'm looking at everything. This is something that I'm going to discuss here in a minute, but there will be kind of an alert to start you out with that there will be some advertisements on here that in reality should make you upset for one reason or another. It is intended just because I want to demonstrate some examples that advertising agencies have done something incorrectly. So please take this as a warning of, again, you might find something on here that upsets you. There will be things on here that have either, hopefully not intended, but unintended racial discrimination or parts with ageism, parts with sexism, parts with homophobia. Again, there's a lot of very heavy things coming on here, and again, I cannot stress it enough that again, it is intended to show this to think about what we are advertising and what we need to avoid when we are coming up with an advertisement, as again to not promote exclusivity and so forth. And again, I'll get into this here in a minute, but for our assignments, this is important that first and foremost that your first case analysis is due today, July 16th at 11:59 p.m. So make sure you're on top of that. I'm going to answer emails as much as up to the due date as possible. I'd say around 10 o'clock at night is my kind of cutoff limit. However, if you emailed me this afternoon, I'm more than likely to catch up to it at some point so that you can finish the assignment in a reasonable amount of time. I've also put up the second case analysis by July 23rd. So that's next Monday. It's going to be worth the same amount as your first case study, which is 20%. So it is a hefty thing if you are not completing it. So make sure that you are staying on top of that. As always, check the discussion board. That is going to be very important. I will mention also as well, within the second case analysis, this is going to be based on something that some of you may or may not find terribly controversial. You may see this promotion as an advertisement and say, you know what, good for this particular organization, which in this case it's Starbucks, for promoting the advertisement that is going to be on the assignment, and that's fine. I will want you to consider, however, again, some people, given the policy of immigration, might be upset with this. Again, you really got to consider this and taking a step back and looking at things like stakeholders of who typically target audiences are within Starbucks. So again, anything that you write needs to be backed up by some of the theoretical constructs that we have gone over in the first week. Again, they are very important to take into consideration when we're talking about that. And again, any questions you might have, feel free to drop a line. I'm more than happy to talk to you about them and put you on the right path for them. So again, that's going to be the majority of them. Again, I might put up a forum. I'll put up a forum sometime this week. So they'll always be due by that Friday. So make sure you're doing those. I've had a couple people that have responded to only one, or some responded to everyone. Make sure you're doing these because again, they're going to come at you pretty quickly. And if you're not ready for them, and they can accumulate very fast in terms of the participation grade within this course. So make sure you're doing them. I've really enjoyed your discussion points so far, and I think they're very interesting, and I can't wait to see what comes up next. So again, just pay attention to your as you learn, and we will go from there. All right, so that out of the way, let's start with a bit of a disclaimer. So within the next few days, especially within this week and jumping into a little bit of next week as well, we're going to be talking about some very controversial topics in terms of, one of the reasons that advertising is has a lot of distrust is placing people into categories, and that's a major facet that people obviously are extremely upset about. So we're going to be talking about racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, stereotypes related to ageism, sexual orientation and ability, advertising towards children. These are all going to be taken into play of the ethical considerations of advertising. So this is kind of the theme of this week. And we're going to do something I think is a little bit more lighthearted, because this is going to be some heavy stuff talking about statistical reporting. So that's going to be Wednesday, is statistical reporting. Now I will mention right off the bat, and this is just something I feel like is necessary to say when talking about anything that revolves around my personal experience versus your personal experience. And since if we're talking about categories and placing people in the categories, I kind of fall under the just about every major category. I am in no way in the minority in a lot of different places, and the reason I bring that up is because I subscribe to a thought process called phenomenology, which basically indicates that in order for real communication to occur, we have to contribute to the fact that we can only attest to what's in our own personal bubble. In other words, you as students, I cannot personally state what are the current troubles with students unless I ask you yourselves and get the word directly from you, because I went to school as an undergrad 10 years ago, so my context may have some similarities, but I can't precisely empathize with everybody just because I went to college at one point in time. So your experience is going to be different, regardless of where you fit in terms of what category, unfortunately, society has placed everybody in. And again, this is something that I'm going to report the information over the next week in a sense that I'm going to look at this in terms of the way that other scholars have mentioned some of these theoretical constructs and some of the fallacies that other people have been very upset by. So this is important, and it needs to be talked about. But again, this is going to be one of the important things with the forums is talking about and discussing some of these issues that occur within advertising and even PR. And if there's anything, and I always do this disclaimer, I know this has taken a while and I apologize. If there's any point in time where you hear me say something that upsets you, please note that it is not my intention to do anything to upset you, nor is it something that, I would be happy to rectify any situation given the fact that you might be upset at something. So again, take everything with a grain of salt. Note that within this particular area, you might be very upset at something. I view a lot of the advertisements that I put up, and I'm pretty upset about them myself. So again, just take that into consideration, and we will go from there. All right. So first and foremost, I always like talking about the instance of problems within advertising. And, one of them in particular I thought was interesting. So if you've been watching the World Cup, an area that you might have noticed is this is more of a xenophobic nature than I would say one that involves race, although race obviously can be associated with xenophobia as well. And it was the World Cup advertisement of joining the wagon. And I like the idea that Volkswagen had in terms of creating an advertisement that was called Join the Wagon. But except they used a few stereotypes within specific countries of, Germany enjoying a bratwurst, or Switzerland having a Swiss Army knife, or Argentinians in this particular case having strong tempers and being very passionate about things. Again, and we'll get into this in terms of a Latin-based community that occurs here. But the problem with this is, and again, this is something that I battle with daily as a advertising professor, and more specifically, a professor that deals with what's called media planning, which, oddly enough, we do a lot of research that puts people into categories. So, and this goes into the first part of it. Why do people use stereotypes, and in this case, racial stereotypes? For one, it's convenient. It is much easier from a survey design standpoint to have a box that has a specific race that we can fill in. And this, for a lot of people, is an issue because they'll sit there and say, why am I filling this out as a specific race or a specific sex? Again, we're dealing with individual people, but it is something that makes things easier. It may also have something to do with product requirements, creative imperatives, racial biases. What else? Why do people use racial stereotypes? And some of these may occur with, again, what is said through our research that we might want to promote. So I'll give you an example. I may have mentioned this before. So for NSAC, we did ocean spray. And I was going through some research of who is the current market for ocean spray. So ocean spray is typically a cranberry juice. And the one thing that we looked up was it was typically men who were over the age of 48, I think it was, and were African American. This is how it was listed on the data. And while looking over this, I had to sit there and said, from the convenience standpoint, they have addressed it in a certain way. And I said, why? I wonder why that specific demographic is the way that it is. And one of the things that I found was through scientific evidence, it stated that men who are African American are twice as likely to develop prostate cancer in their later years. And so this is one of the reasons why people would drink cranberry juices to help prevention of prostate cancer. So again, this was a notion where you can view it in the sense of maybe this helps, or does this hurt a certain community, again, by having to explicitly state through survey design who's going to be advertised to. So unintended effects, I hope it is never the intention of any advertising organization or any PR organization to ever submit an advertisement without really thinking it through of, is this considered racist? But I think there is a lot of instances where I didn't really want to do something. I didn't want to exclude people or create in-groups or out-groups, but it is something that ended up happening. And there are things like marginalization, perceptions of diversity, fetishization. One thing I like to stay on is social identity theory. And this includes an us or them, an in-group or out-group discourse, depending on, again, how you identify as a person. And so this also really deals with expectancy theory, and more specifically expectancy violation of what I expect to see versus what I do see. And this can be an issue in terms of what is the violation that is occurring within what I am seeing. And again, these are going to be specific minority groups that are represented in advertising and the problems that come with them. So again, I'm going to show some advertisements that are very much controversial, and they may offend you in some case. So again, take these as what they are in terms of things not to do, as this is very important here. So first and foremost, we have racial tendencies and racism when it came to re-civilization in this case. And so this obviously plays a little bit of a role of how African Americans were perceived when it came to this whole notion of savagery. And this is unfortunately a dark past in our country in terms of depictions of African Americans. And so in this case, it was the maybe not the implication that Nivea was trying to go for, but again, it really, the context of re-civilize as well as the head that's being carried and thrown away really does not paint the image well for the community. And this is, again, a major problem to be consideration. And we have to think of this in terms of what specifically are things that we need to think about when we're thinking about advertising within minorities, because we should absolutely include people of different races, creeds, gender, so many different things we absolutely should include. But it's, again, the way that it is represented is a very important consideration. And it is a big deal. Again, from a phenomenological standpoint, it is a big deal for many people because, again, it is their walk of life that they're coming from. And so, you know, this should be a conversation of, again, what not to do in this case. Again, Vogue, I really can't defend this a lot, and I'm not trying to defend any of them really, by what the implications of this looks like in terms of LeBron James in this case looking like a beast. And this actually goes with a study that talked about specific rhetoric in sports of classifying African American athletes that would say things that were of beastly nature. So again, this goes back to said person is a beast. Said person has animalistic qualities towards them. And you may have heard this in terms of sports discourse. They may even use the term like freak, for instance. And again, this was something that was classified within African American discourse from, I can't remember what journal it was, but was talking about it. But again, really played in the emphasis of how this cover was published in Vogue here. Other things we can look at is subservient roles, nannies, chauffeurs. This actually subscribes to if you are an advocate of film and the entertainment industry in terms of the way things are depicted there. There's a very popular theory that talks about what's called the magical Negro theory. And again, this, I don't like saying a word like that, but this is unfortunately this is what the theory is named, which basically states that, for instance, one of the movies that was mentioned was Legend of Bagger Vance, where Will Smith plays a subservient role in going within a lot of the racial stereotypes that occur of how to address people. Again, that they are not a prominent actor or actress within the particular film that's being shown. And again, you can see that within this particular area within African Americans in advertising. And again, a lot of this comes back into marginalizing. And this can be also assumed with generalizing how diversity is portrayed in terms of what we know. And again, social identity theory of the us versus them. And again, I don't think people intend to do a lot of this stuff, but it is something that anytime that you're going through copy or art, it is the ethical consideration that you need to come into, because, and rightfully so, this is the kind of thing that can ruin an organization. Again, Starbucks is probably one of the more interesting examples with Race Together, where, again, rightfully so, people said, I don't have the time to talk about hundreds of years of racial discrimination while I'm getting my latte. Again, and if you're not familiar with this example, it was to write Race Together on the Starbucks coffee cup and talk about racial discrimination within the country. And again, a lot of people just said, I don't have the time for this. And what made things even worse was the page with like the CEOs and the CFOs and the COOs were typically white men. So that did not help the case in terms of talking about racial discrimination. Supporting or decorative roles. This is, again, where, and unfortunately a lot of universities are guilty of this, is playing the sense of only different races in some extent, or only having a particular race demonstrated in one instance within an advertisement. It's almost like the organization is aware that they need to include somebody different from what is portrayed in the advertisement. Again, whether it be a different skin color, whether it be a different sex, they feel like that's the need to be able to do that. And again, that in itself is wrong, to portray this perceived difference. And I make sure I note the term perceived difference in this case, because we're all human. Other things is talking about traditional roles here. And this actually was mentioned in a Dave Chappelle stand-up routine where you're talking about some of the roles that are established within an African-American community of playing music or being an athlete. And this is the way that, again, African-Americans are perceived. And again, playing these limited roles does get into, go back here, marginalization and social identity, to where African Americans can only fit in this role, which obviously is just not true. Other things we can look at, I mean, and this is still going on with Popeyes, of stereotypes of food preferences. And again, I'm not going to go into detail with a lot of these, but again, we can understand why some of this is considered racially profiling and racially marginalizing, based on, again, jobs, based on food preferences, that kind of thing. As well as hip-hop cultural stereotypes can be included. Now, we couldn't look at this in terms of who is represented in the industry of, particular celebrities that we know of that are industrious within hip-hop. Or, however, it is, again, the area that we don't want to provide exclusivity in this case. And this is another one in terms of the notion of actually whitening Beyonce Knowles cosmetics, which again is obviously, in this case, this is more kind of expectancy violation in terms of making sure that the color of one's skin is actually a very beautiful thing and should never be tampered with. And I mean, we'll get into this when we talk about gender on both sides, and really on all sides, really, is this whole notion of what do we consider the stereotypical man in, like health magazines, and the same with women, because we always talk about body profiles and how that should work. Well, it works the same way in terms of racial discrimination, is the whole notion of the skin pigment really shouldn't matter in this case of why in the world should we put in whitening in this case for this advertisement? But again, there are obviously other examples that we can use within like Hispanic stereotypes of over-sexualizing Latinas and Latinos for this case. And again, this happens a lot within advertising in general in terms of particularly within gender communication. But we might also look in terms of gangsters or manual labor. I mean, we look at, again, these go back to what we were talking about in terms of traditional roles and limited roles, in terms of what is perceived within a the Latin community, pardon. We might also look in terms of the salsa dancer or lucha libre. And again, by itself, the roles and constructs are embedded within cultures. However, again, we need to make sure that we're not using these as stereotypes in this particular case. Also, another thing that we should think about is I will show y'all a model. I'll try to do it tomorrow just because I don't have it pulled up on my computer right now. Is a model called Taylor Strategy Wheel. And it talks about how we should treat our creative advertising. And in one case, it's like a social demeanor. So like if you were to see a Pizza Hut commercial or any kind of pizza commercial, one of the best ways that they advertise it is, promoting it with family. So I'm with my family in terms of when I have movie night and eat pizza in this kind of case. So this was the area within Kraft Macaroni and Cheese that kind of played on the collectivist nature of a family-oriented culture in Hispanics, which again, most Hispanic cultures are typically in a collectivist standpoint, but this is going a little too far in this particular case. Asian stereotypes as well, and Asian stereotypes are very difficult because we're talking about a grand community of are we referring to Asian through people who are from India or the South Pacific or Japan or China or whatever it may be. But again, over sexualization within female Asians as well come into play here, as well as the potential positive stereotype of, and I say positive, of it's framed that it's a good thing that that many people perceive Asian communities as very intelligent, but it is hurtful in the sense that we're talking about, again, as a race relation here of overgeneralizing and marginalizing, or talking about tech in this case. So although we're perceiving something that could be a good thing, as in, again, this could be perceptually that, again, within culture of gaming and so forth, but at the same time, it does affect this any community negatively. Same thing with action figures in terms of martial arts or odd accents. Again, you can see these throughout many different representations, not just advertising, but in movies as well. Oops, pressed the wrong button. So how do we break some of these racial stereotypes? Again, this is an uncomfortable topic to be talking about. And it is important to recognize how we can break some of these molds of, again, referring to all of us as individual people. And again, advertising is important because we want to be able to demonstrate and persuade people towards a product or a service that may do some good. So we may want to promote something of a good corporate social responsibility that may break the status quo a little bit, but ultimately brings in a strong togetherness of, again, taking away the exclusivity and the in-group versus out-group and again, making us all part of a community, ideally. And so we talk about a couple of different ones again, but mentioned with a lot of controversy as well. Not so much the because football. I don't know if I've ever talked to anybody that was really upset about that one. In fact, I really enjoyed that commercial. Coca-Cola's big game commercial in 2014, as well as the religion of togetherness in, I think it was last Super Bowl, that were controversial. Coca-Cola's big game, I don't know if y'all remember this one, was singing the national anthem in different languages and promoting the notion of togetherness through the diversity that this country provides. And many people praised Coca-Cola, thought it was a great idea to include that. And other people were not as sympathetic to say that this was a bigger political ideology that was being distributed here. And this is an area where it can be a little difficult of finding that right balance between, again, removing the exclusivity and making a statement. Because it may be your intention that you say, honestly, I just want to remove the marginalization that occurs and kind of bring everybody together. And I'm not doing it for a political reason. I'm just doing this because, I like that aspect of phenomenology, of diversity within this nature. And again, Hyundai's area was because football. And again, if you're watching the World Cup, I know a lot of people who call it soccer. I personally try to call it football in general. I say, you know what, if Southerners, it's unfortunately we call soft drinks, especially in my hometown of Rocky Mountain, many people mention it as Coke. Everything's Coke. I'm like, you know what? If we can reference every soft drink as Coke, we can certainly say football in the summer is different from football in the fall, and we can still use both. But, again, this is the notion of we call it soccer here in the United States. But I think this commercial was really funny. Not only it was great because it was aired in English and Spanish, and notably Spanish was part of the controversy, unfortunately. However, the other instance was, again, the hashtag here. And it just demonstrates how much we as a society have grown to care about football. And I'm saying football, not soccer. That people were watching this year's World Cup. And it was really enjoyable. Other things we can put into play is putting people that were considered in minorities or are minorities into a lot of positions of power and portray that embodiment. This was, again, for racially, when we're talking about superhero movies, the notion of Black Panther and how, again, this may not have been the first time a African American was put in a role as a hero. There's plenty of movies with that, but this was a milestone within superhero movies that was praised in terms of this, removing marginalization. It's the same with the new, Star Wars movie Rogue One. If you've ever watched that before, with talking about the main character, and I'm losing what his name was, but it is a very strong person in the Hispanic community of a great actor. He's in the Terminal. Again, I'm blanking on his name. But there were some stories on Twitter that really caught my eye of how they didn't have him remove his accent of, the traditional way that he speaks. And that was praised by so many people, and rightfully so. And again, it really had a strong impact within a Hispanic community that said this portrayed and embodied us so well. Modelo has been doing that recently in terms of talking about people who are Hispanic that have accomplished, milestones within like the first Hispanic pilot, female pilot, excuse me. And again, that was a sense of empowerment to propose here. Other things, again, we need to promote these in any kind of racial stereotype as they are. I mean, this goes within gender communication as well. We've talked about the Dove ads before, and the Dove ads, as much as Unilever, you can't help but be a little too extremely upset with the way that women are portrayed in Axe commercials. However, the Dove commercials in this case, from a utilitarian perspective, as y'all said in your comments through the discussion board, portrayed things very accurately. And again, it's something that we portray things as they should. And again, that's empowering, which in a lot of ways we talk about advertising as keeping things light and fun. And it is why we test advertisements to make sure that before we send them out to the public, as it's something that will upset other people. And that is a major consideration within advertising, and why we need to make sure that when we're discussing ideas for advertisement, how are we finding ourselves to portray other people? And how can that unintentionally hurt other people, or perceptions of, again, things like race, and where they develop stereotypes in this particular case. So again, this is a topic that obviously needs to be talked about and thought about. And so, for discussion boards, we will talk about, again, the notion of racial, gender, sexual orientation, ability, age, and through things like advertising to children and the ethical qualms that exist within them. So, again, take these things as examples of what not to do, and really think about any time that you're writing copy or creating an image, how are we unintentionally might affect specific groups. So again, that's going to be it for today. We will talk about gender stereotypes tomorrow, as well as a little bit of subliminal advertising, and we'll go from there. So thank you all for listening today. Again, send me any emails you might have in terms of discussion about the lecture, as well as discussion within case analysis. If you need any help for tonight, or have any questions about the next one, I'm all ears. So happy to help wherever I can. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk with you tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.